strong and fancy word that academics use to talk about study of cities. So I study architecture, which is mainly buildings, and I study cities, so my broad interest is the built environment. So urbanism is the study of cities. So I will try to solve this problem. So I no problem. So I will start my presentation. It's called Serampore and Other Colonial Cities. Before starting, I also would like to thank for all these beautiful gifts that that honor me a lot. So thank you very much. So my presentation is called Serampore and Other Colonial Cities in India. Before coming here, I was in Trankebar, which is a former Danish colonial city in Tamil Nadu, and I was in Puducherry, which is a former French colonial city in Tamil Nadu also. So I will address Serampore, Trankebar, and Puducherry, and how time influences the study of cities, and how colonial cities are different and comparable at the same time. While historical texts have been long subject to critical scrutiny, the formal and historical problems raised by graphic representations of time have largely been absent from scholarly attention. This paper opens a generic plea for the deconstruction of historical notions of time in India through the analysis of the urban cartography of the former Danish colonial cities of Trankebar, today's Tarangambadi, on the southeastern coast of India, and Serampore, today's Srinagar, on the northeastern coast of India, and the former French colonial city of Pondicherry, today's Puducherry, on the southeastern coast. On the southeastern coast of India. We will argue that urban spatial form as the perceptual basis of a notion of time that we literally cannot tell time without the mediation of urban space. In many ways, this work reflects the lines that makes up historical maps, straight and curved, branching and crossing, plain and adorned, technical and artistic. We argue that contrary to conventional wisdom, the line is a considerably more intricate and vibrant figure representing time. As a result, spatial figures contaminate the temporal language used in charting the colonial cities. We will address long and short times, spaces in between, literally intervals, before and after, all implicit metaphors that rely on the idea of time as a linear continuum. The experience of simultaneity or discontinuity imposed by colonialism on buildings, architecture, urban planning, and the city's spatial organization is based on different spatial images from those involved in continual sequel experiences of time. Continuity and sequentiality are spatial images based on the unbroken line or surface schema. South Asian cities and the colonial cities built by Europeans in South Asia were communal artifacts managed by officials who received their appointments directly from the king or as members of hierarchical administrative structure who were ultimately answerable to the king. What we can learn about time by investigating the physical and geographical environments of colonial and post-colonial societies. This means buildings, architecture, urban planning, and spatial organization of the city will be one of the main themes to be addressed. And conversely, what can be understood about the physical and spatial environment by looking at the temporalities that supported the markedly different political cultures of cities built by Europeans in widely separated regions of South Asia, and to what extent were they fundamentally the same as each other? And contrary-wise, what can be learned about geographical and physical environment by looking at the temporalities that confirm the marked differences in the political cultures of cities built by Europeans in widely separated regions of South Asia? And to what extent were they essentially the same as metropolitan Europe? We will discuss how colonial cities and indigenous traditions in former European colonial cities in India are historically intertwined. We will also examine, contrast, and analyze colonial cities, cultural, social, yes. Okay, thank you. We'll, okay.
Hello?
I'll keep going with this one. We will also examine, contrast, and analyze colonial cities' cultural, social, political, and urban histories influenced by racial, ethnic, caste, and gender-based ideas. Last, we shall comprehend how these histories change perceptions of the public and the private, as well as political imagination, government ownership and dispossession, social interaction. And finally, the use of land in Tranquebar, Seramfort, and
জাস্ট এটা ধরো তো এরকম করে ধরবে ফোনের দিকে একটা দিকে যেন চলতে থাকে
Every culture writes its own history and develops its own concept of time by adopting one or more temporalities and making its own calendar. When cultures come together, as East and West, temporalities may cross, interact, support, and contradict one another. What does exchange look like when several temporal senses collide? How do these encounters between East and West help shape an identity over time? Time is constructed through intricate processes, including ideology, cultural tradition, and social customs. Because time is not universally comprehended in the same way, it cannot be perceived or represented in a way that is independent of the institutions and customs that mark time, as well as the famous papers, monuments, architecture, and cities that materialize it. Geographical space is given precedence in the study of spatial history as the narrative framework for illustrating change. Spatial history excels when revealing subtle processes that often get lost in the shadows of grand, even-driven narratives. Urbanism is the growing occurrence of terms, of events, particularly the building of architecture, the public realm, and the utilization of space. By placing this global trend in the philosophical notions of time, the economic and technological process of global change, and the social and individual realities of life in the Danish colonial city and in the French colonial city in India, This study builds a theoretical and critical analysis. It provides a critical assessment of urbanism, outlining its historical background and how it contributes to precarity and anxiety while posing innovative possibilities for the study of colonial cities. It makes the case that urbanism should be understood in terms of the dynamics of urban temporality, including how time moves through cities, where urbanism fits into larger context of the city's many complex time frames and life cycles, and how time is depicted in European colonial cities, constructing an order of events from a collection of spatial temporal fragments involves using time's substantive, relational, and intuitive ideas. Therefore, we aim to examine how maps, as a Western representation of the colonial city, became implicated in historical research and inquiry as essential empirical evidence about the past whose scientific and political significance require their collection, preservation and classification in private and public archives and libraries. Each of the episodes discussed are associated with a developing network of private map collections that combined and recombined over time and eventually merged into national collections where they became essential components in the vast archipelago of published and unpublished documentation by which the modernizing Indian nation state was defined. The following makes use of the map, those specialized repositories of ordered spatial knowledge whose constitutive geographies can be analyzed through their content and their organization, arrangement, and location to triangulate the relationship between the map as a visual representation and the city as a nexus of cultural and political authority. The colonial city of Trankebar, today's Tranquebar, was located in the southeastern coast of India, called the Coromandel Coast in today's province of Tamil Nadu. When the Danish Admiral Ovgid arrived on the Coromandel Coast in the autumn of 1620 with his fleet, they were not the first to set foot on these shores. For many years, a large population had lived on the flat, fertile floodplain, which could be irrigated yearly and produce rice. Along the coast, there were some small villages and small urban settlements where the inhabitants were fishermen. Muslim and Portuguese merchants had also settled in some of these urban settlements. The place where Ovgid came was also a fisherman merchant village, situated where one of the most minor tributaries of the Calvary River flows into the Bay of Bengal. The fishermen lived in their palm huts on the shoreline, while the traders had moved further inland. The Muslims had settled around the mosque, which probably stood there in 1620, while the Portuguese lived in a close neighborhood a little further south. The Danes built a wall extending as far as the waterfront facing the Bay of Bengal. A roughly rectangular area of approximately half a mile in its smaller size and 1.5 in its more extended length made a perimeter of the wall that encircled the original fort and a city that was now fully protected. Against the northern wall lay the settlement established by the Tamil Muslims. After the 17th century, the Danish settlement, which was also Christian, grew close to the fort since Tamil Nadu and the Tamils were no longer a threat. Within this rectangle, communities evolved over the next 200 years, expanding into an area between the Tamil settlement and the fort, a hybrid building that combined Islamic and European military architecture. How the colonial city developed inside its walls, it's unusual among European colonial urban settlements in India. Usually, such urban areas were characterized by the fort, inhabited by Europeans, the non-edificant area, open esplanade between the fort and the pre-existing settlements, a site where buildings were demolished to create a protective buffer between colonizer and colonized, and the urban settlement surrounded by a wall and inhabited only by the Christians, European Christians, native Christians, and other Europeans. At some distance, outside the walled area, would be the urban settlement inhabited by non-Christians. In Tranquebar, however, the people following non-Christian religions, Hindus, Muslims, and Jains, share the space within the walls, all under Danish colonial rule. There was no boundary between the pre-existing settlement and the new Danish settlement. The fortified perimeter encompassed the areas where both Christians and non-Christians lived, as well as the fort. And like many other colonial cities, no black and white urban settlements existed. The large area within a perimeter wall created a space of connection similar to that of Pondicherry and Diu, respectively French and Portuguese former colonial cities in India. However, Tranquebar and Pondicherry were built during the 17th and 18th century, more than a century and a half after the establishment of the Portuguese in Diu. These settlements comprised a fort inhabited exclusively by Europeans, an esplanade, a white village and a native village, all within a wall inhabited by both Europeans and natives. Some former English colonial cities, such as, for example, Calcutta and Bombay, had no fortified perimeter, only a fort. Pondicherry was a French colonial settlement located in southeastern India, also on the Coromandel coast. It stretches across the two tributaries of Senju River and is favorably linked with places of production of cotton textiles and with places of important maritime trade routes. The role of administration was no doubt crucial, as Pondicherry can be regarded among the most planned cities of that time. It thus owed its rise as much to its international trade linkages as to the favorable geopolitical factors. Its decline is yet another example of the effect of international political economy and the internal political situation on European settlements. Unlike the Portuguese, racial segregation was a norm among the French, even from their early presence in India. In 1673, the French Compagnie des Indes successfully acquired a trading post called Pondicherry from Sher Kanlodi, the governor of Ali Kondapuramin in the Carnatic. Soon, this small hamlet developed into Pondicherry. Under the command of François Martin, the French managed to set up a factory, build a fort to attract craftsmen, and succeeded in making this place a fairly large and prosperous urban settlement. The pattern of urbanization of Pondicherry had certain distinctive features regarding land usage. The town was demarcated into residential, commercial, religious, gardens and parks, and port spaces. The urban plan of Pondicherry reflects the dispersal of the population on racial, religious, caste, and professional grounds. The urban plan combined the courtyard and the garden into a single space. However, the city's main buildings were usually located frontally between an entrance courtyard and the garden in the back. The houses in the White Town usually open into a garden and not directly onto a street, were flat, with terraced non-sloping roofs, and finally, brick was the main building material and not stones. The French houses in Pondicherry show the deviation from the houses in France, according to Berestein, Saint-Exupéry, and Chakalov, and I'm translating. The architecture of Pondicherry is cosmopolitan. Variations across the landscape, from a French architecture of exported models to a traditional Tamil architecture via a situational hybrid architecture. Similarly, the Indian houses reflected close cross-cultural influences and revealed European influence to some extent. After the 18th century, religious tolerance and the prolonged absence of conflict were key political features of Tranquebar. The peace within the city and between Tranquebar and the hinterland to the north, south and west meant that Tranquebar, and thus any plans for the city, was no longer subject to an imposed frontier that fostered extension and difference. No further attention was necessary to continue perceiving its wall as an architectural subject separating Tranquebar from the subcontinent. The perpetuity of peace was accepted, and consequently the idea of a whole colonial city was abandoned. The colonial city of Serampore was located in northeastern India in today's province of Bengal. Since the second half of the 18th century, became the commercially most important colony of the Kingdom of Denmark-Norway. But it's only now that we are aware of the fact that there once lived about 10,000 people, the vast majority of them Indians, under Danish-Norwegian rule near Kolkata, which was then the center of British colonialism in India. In the decades after 1800, Serampore was thus not only one of the largest towns in the Danish-Norwegian monarchy, from 1814 only Danish, but also home of the Serampore College, which played an essential role in developing Indian identity concerning the British colonial power. Although the colonial state was extractive, it was not hegemonic, since it did not only control even the elite of India's mentalities and beliefs. This also happened in Serampore. But it wasn't dominant in all Indian society either. The state depended heavily on Indian agency everywhere and was weak at its edges. It was frequently divided into rival agencies. There were two effects on this. First, it gave Indian corporate organizations, landlord king groups, purported caste associations, and other status groups plenty of room for maneuver that had previously developed during a period of Mughal decentralization. Indians were able to create their potential thanks to the image of India throughout transition to colonialism. Indians started appropriating and adapting European institutions and tactics to their own forms of sociality before the end of the 19th century to improve their quality and rebel against the extractive colonial state, as Serampore became an example. The requirement for European and colonial states to delegate legal, economic, military, educational, and finally political authority to indigenous people to save labor, blood, and treasure significantly aided this development. Therefore, a historical examination of how, when, and why indigenous people appropriated, adapted, absorbed, and frequently wholly reconstituted European-style institutions in light of their own mental and material capacities may benefit the discussion about the role of institutions in the development of cities like Serampore after modernity. In contrast to their colonial origins, the idea put out in this talk is that comparative urban development has hybrid, if not heterogeneous, origins. Thank you very much. This red